Three, two, one. Panel. We believe that everyone in society has a right to feel comfortable and safe within their environment. We believe that the current condition where people in status quo are very insistent on labeling people is very toxic and one we cannot stand. We cannot support a stance that advocates for said labeling in society and feel everyone has the right to integrate comfortably within society. And because this is our stance within the debate, we are proud to propose. Now, how do we characterize the debate? Panel. When you look at status quo, we live in a very discriminatory society where where people who are different and deviate from the stereotypical majority struggle to find acceptance in society. This creates a very dangerous environment for said people because from discrimination, this turns to hate, and hate can often turn to violence. This necessitates the need for these people to protect themselves, right? One such group of people that has suffered a lot because of this discriminatory nature of society is the transgender community. We characterize the transgender person as someone who doesn't feel comfortable being associated with the gender identity they would be assigned from birth. They would want to be treated and perceived societally as the gender opposite from the one that they've been assigned. What do we mean by perceived? We mean not just from a standpoint where we talk about physicality and what they look like, but how they documents, ladies and gentlemen. This is how we believe that this a transgender person is someone who doesn't want to be labeled simply and identified as a trans person, right? Because ladies and gentlemen, it is with their own interest to feel comfortable as not as something more than just a label, right? What do we talk about when you talk about aspirations, ladies and gentlemen? When you talk about aspiring to get cis passing privilege, right? Again, we don't talk about simply the physical aspects, right? We talk about a transgender person wanting, for example, a transgender man was previously a female, right? Wanting to be perceived as a male legally, regardless of what they look like, ladies and gentlemen. This means that they gain the privilege that other people would gain, right? This is what aspiring for this privilege looks like, despite what they look like, right? Getting these legal documents, right? Ladies and gentlemen. So what are our metrics of support? When you talk about aspire, why do we believe that one should aspire for such emotion, right? Why should we support this? It's because one, we support something when when the mitigation of discrimination is one that is optimal on a certain side, right? In this case, it looks like people being accepted more, right? And people being more comfortable in how they live on a day-to-day basis, right? And not feeling attacked or labeled by anyone, right? Another metric of support that we have identified is that it has to benefit the most vulnerable stakeholder within the debate. This stakeholder being the actual transgender person and how they identify themselves and how they live on a day-to-day basis, right? So this benefit can look like, finding jobs easier, not being discriminated up against, right? This is our second metric of support. Now, what is our line of argument, right? Firstly, we believe that on a principle level, right, regardless of practical outcome, it is only right that people aspire for this, right? Because everyone has a right to feel represented, right? Everyone has a right to integrate into society easier, right? And this is why on a principle level, on a moral level, it is correct for these transgender people to aspire for said cisgender passing privilege, right? Our second argument is that by transgender people advocating for and aspiring for cis-passing privilege, it mitigates the discrimination that they face on a day-to-day basis. It allows them to integrate easier into society and allows them to be more comfortable within their skin, right? And lastly, why we believe that they should, in fact, aspire for cis-passing privilege is because in status quo, this is, and according to our characterization, it is actually in line with what a trans person would want, ladies and gentlemen, which is being perceived by society, not more than just being perceived by society as a male, regardless of what they look like, right? And not being labeled, ladies and gentlemen, right? I will talk about how it is better about the principal argument and I'll touch on the how it mitigates the discrimination in society. While my second speaker will come in and reinforce our argument, ladies and gentlemen. Now on to my substantive matter. Firstly, why is this correct on a principle level? Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a society where people on a day-to-day basis feel discriminated against. This is particularly evident in the transgender society, right? Where they don't feel comfortable in their own skin, right? And they want to be perceived as a male, right? Regardless of what they look like. If I'm a male and I want to be perceived as a female, regardless of what I look like, right? It is only right that in society people denied. It is only right that in society people are perceived by this, right, ladies and gentlemen. This is why we advocate for this cis-passing privilege for transgender people, right? This is why they should, in fact, aspire to privilege as it has been labeled, because they have the right to integrate into society comfortably and not face discrimination that they would on a day-to-day basis, right, regardless of any practical outcome. But again, we tell you that there is, in fact, a practical outcome to them aspiring for this cis-passing privilege. We tell you that it mitigates this leads me to my second point. We tell you that it mitigates the discrimination that they give them when that they face when someone has this cis-passing privilege and they're not simply perceived as a trans person, but they as a trans male, and they're perceived as a male, regardless of what they look like, it allows them to integrate into society easier. When you remove the fact that on their birth certificate or on their IDs it says trans male to just male, it allows them to integrate into society easier and become more comfortable within the society. They face less discrimination on a day-to-day basis than they would, because panel, the amount of hate crimes and the amount of discrimination that the trans community faces on a day-to-day basis is not right. It is not moral, it is not ethical, and we cannot support it. Rather them aspiring for the cis-passing privilege allows them to integrate into society easier, because they are perceived as more than just a trans male. They're perceived as a male, right? The side opposition might come up and say, wow, this in fact mitigates the whole purpose of being a person, right? It mitigates their identity, right? We tell you, no, panel, according to what a trans person wants, right? Yes, obviously they want to be perceived as a male, and we tell you that they should be able to simply be perceived as a male. Obviously, this doesn't mean that it takes away from any benefactor of their identity. They are still a trans person, but the perception of society is now shifted from just labeling them as just a trans person. This is why we believe that we should support this motion, because our side of the house brings up more advantages for the trans community. Because our side of the house better ensures protection of the trans community and is on the ethical high ground, we are proud to propose this motion.
Thank the first speaker proposition or the Prime Minister for that. Welcome the leader of opposition and opposition speaker to begin their speech. Here.
Hi, I want to check if I am audible. Can people hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. So I use the pronouns she, her, and I prefer for my PI to be offered verbally, please. All right, so if everything's all right, then I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. What happens in Proposition's world is that those people who are already marginalized in society within the transgender community are going to be further marginalized when you tell someone who's non-binary or gender fluid that they must aspire to look like a certain cisgender type of person in order to fit into society better and in order to prevent the mislabeling, which is already bigoted and wrong. So where are we clashing with Prop so far? It's on this idea about the best belief to protect trans community. I do agree that we both want to benefit the most vulnerable stakeholder here, but we disagree that discrimination is going to be removed by using proposition cisgender privilege as this kind of mechanism. So what's this debate really about? Three core questions. Firstly, how can we best protect the trans community? Secondly, where can identities be best preserved? And thirdly, how can we best change perceptions on gender in the long term? Before that, we need to recontextualize something that wasn't dealt with in a P1, which is on this idea of cisgender privilege. So this is this idea about the community aspiring to look like a certain biological male or female in order to be more accepted as they set in their P1 into a society. So now let's look at the three core premises that we got in their speech. The first one was around how they want to be perceived as a gender like. I tell you that this is a mischaracterization because cisgender privilege in its nature encourages people to look like traditional cisgender males or females. We don't think you actually achieve this kind of aim as you want it to be done with your own mechanism. Second premise was around how they don't want people to be labeled and how everyone has a right to feel accepted into society. Well, we're telling you here that misgendering is only going to be solved in the long term through a culture of respect, which we achieve when we flag you when I get there in my own argument. And then lastly, they tell us about how they want to mitigate discrimination. Well, the only way that true change is going to be achieved in the long term is for the trans people and the community to be open about it and to tell people that we as a community want people to respect us for who we are, and not just simply by telling us that we look like a certain type of people and that we are just fitting like this traditional norm that has been widely spread throughout the century. So at the end of my rebuttal, it's clearly seen how, comparatively speaking, we don't think their mechanism truly achieves the change they want to be done at the end of their case. So now I'll be moving on to my first core question. This is going to reach the conclusion of how they're going to create exclusion and furthermore not change the stigma. First layer is going to be looking at exclusion itself. So we tell you that there's many different abilities for different people within the community to transition, and it's very dependent on the socioeconomic status, on the amount of money they have, and also their location, and furthermore their current identity, which means that intersectionality exists within the trans community. And I'm flagging here, we don't think this point around intersectionality has been well developed and also looked at from Proposition's case, and we need to understand that it exists on a spectrum. So which means that the most vulnerable actors, poor person living in a conservative Middle Eastern country, simply can't afford to do like the surgeries and also medical procedures in order to look cisgender enough. And this kind of idea that in order to truly fit into a society like Proposition has characterized, they need to look cis enough. And we don't think they have the ability to do that. So then what's the strategic impact of this layer? It actively shows you why we think this idea is extremely harmful and why Proposition's world prevents and also furthermore excludes minorities within the trans community itself, which is already an existing minority. And we don't think creating more minorities within the minority group itself is something to be supported. And we would never support something that excludes a certain group of actors. So then on to the second layer in this core question, which is going to be dealing with social stigma. I'm flagging here this is directly clashing with their matter on how they want to mitigate discrimination. So we don't say that your world's going to be changing anything for the better, because society will then be perceiving trans people not as their own individual important identities, but rather as like cisgender wannabes, because instead of trying to fit into another community, the trans community should embrace themselves and also create more awareness and also understanding. Because what needs to be understood is that the only way for more understanding and also less stigma in society to be achieved is for the current society, which is majorly cisgender, to be more understanding of what these trans people are going through. And the impact we're looking at here is that the society will not be incentivized to understand people who are now also identified as cisgender, and the stigma on trans people is not going to change if every single person in this community is telling others that we should all aspire to become like a certain stereotype of like this certain cisgender. So at the end of this first core question, it's very clear that by doing a comparison between our side of the world, which doesn't exclude people, and furthermore tells the transgender community to embrace themselves and also to change the stigma in the long term, we think this is much better than Proposition's world of exclusions. Now let's move on to the second core question. This is reaching a conclusion of how we'll be creating insecurity and furthermore probably removing identity, something we don't support. Firstly, it's looking at this transition process. We see it's often important, it's an important part of trans people's identities and also experience. And the impact of this characterization is that proposition will be removing this core identity of a certain person. And this is something we don't think is valuable or acceptable. Then the second layer is we looking at how not all trans people want to identify as cisgender. For example, there's people who are non-binary, there's many spectrum that's very large, and also there's gender fluid people. And we think these kinds of people within the trans community are going to be further excluded by this new idea that side prop. And the impact of this note here is that they're further excluding another group of actors, and we don't think proposition rarely achieves their own burden of protecting people's identities and also protecting them from harms and also being mislabeled within the current society. So now let's move on to the third layer of insecurity. I'm once again flagging here because this is also clashing with some parts of Prop's arguments. So we tell you that cisgender privilege is in some ways very toxic because this aspiration to conform to a certain identity is inherently toxic, and I don't think telling people to aspire to a certain thing is inherently good because it further marginalizes people who don't want to conform. Once again, bring in the examples of people who perhaps want to be non-binary or gender fluid. And note here, the impact of this layer is very important as it directly clashes with them, and it shows you the harms that are inherent within propositions world of toxicity and also necessary pressure created. You're out of time. So now let's look at, even in opposition's worst case scenario, why we are still going to be better than proposition. Let's say that propositions, all of their goals and aims of mitigating discrimination and also removing mislabeled stuff is going to be achieved. We still think actors who due to intersectionality cannot fit into the trans community nor the cisgender community, because they simply can't afford to do surgeries and medical procedures to become this kind of new cisgender privilege and this idea that's going to be condoned by this trans community. And furthermore, you're excluding people who perhaps don't even want to identify as a certain gender or look like a certain way, which is why we think you're going to be perpetrating furthermore harmful ideas that not only divides the community itself, but furthermore you exclude people from what they really want to be. You're not protecting any vulnerable actor. We think your mechanism fails at its very core.
Thanks, edition. That's welcome. Yeah.
Yes. I'm really just going to assume that's a yes.
You are audible.
Okay. Pronouns are she, her. I'll be taking my POIs verbally, but I'll indicate when it is I'm taking POIs. Granted, I'm still audible. I will be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, we refuse to accept the straw manning that has taken place from side opposition bench, right? We state to you clearly that perception does not necessarily equate to appearance. A perception is how somebody conceives something, therefore it is mental and not necessarily appearance, right? So we advocating that people fully transition, which is a gross misconception that we get from opposition. We're not advocating that people fully transition, but we're saying that at the point in which somebody has cis privilege, right? This cis privilege looks something like people, legal documents, instead of saying you're a transgender male, says that you're a male, and that's the end of the story, right? We tell you that this is the perception that we're advocating for. So at the point in which side opposition wants to argue that we have decided to side opposition wants to argue that we have decided to force people into specific identities or force people into certain bodies that they don't want to be in. We refuse this characterization of prop case. Now, what you're going to get from my speech, you're going to get two rebuttals from the major. You're going to get two rebuttals from the major cases that we get up, as well as more constructive matter about the pragmatic benefits that we get from side proposition. Now, first thing that we get from side op, this idea of perception, right? They tell us that. So first of all, we tell you that perception does not directly equate to appearance, right? We tell you that when a perception is achieved, right? When a transgender person is perceived as cisgender, we tell you that this looks like documents, right? This looks like them not being discriminated against, or them not necessarily being labeled strictly as a transgender person, but them being labeled as whatever they've chosen to transition into, right? Now, even if we were to say that this perception directly equates to appearance, right? This is when we bring in the pragmatic benefits that we have. We tell, which I'm going to add on to during my constructive matter. We tell you that a transgender person is far more willing to look a specific way if that means that they're going to get jobs, let's say, if that means that they're not going to have to risk their life when they walk on the street. We tell you that the most basic right that a human being has is the right to life. At the point in which that right to life is put at risk because of how they identify or because of how they look, we tell you that a transgender person is far more willing to lean towards looking a specific way. So when we tackle this point that they have at its best, we tell you that outside of the house still wins on this clash because people will prioritize the right to life, the right to not being discriminated against, the right to jobs and the like over the right to self-expression. The second thing that we get, they tell us that people now have no incentive to understand how transgender people live, and they tell us that the transgender community has no chance to grow on outside of the house. What we responses to this? First of all, we say either way on both sides of the house, there's true incentive. Side opposition has decided to structure their argument in a utopic world where society is accepting and a utopic world where society is open to any and everything, right? We tell you that this is a gross misconception or mischaracterization of society. We tell you we live in a society where a lot of people are discriminate against others, where people are conservative, right? Even though we've seen growth, we tell you that this growth is not enough for people to simply step out, for people to be incentivized to look into what transgender people are all about and what transgender people believe in, right? In status quo, we see that people are still not necessarily interested in understanding how a transgender person works, right? Or how the transgender community stands, or what this transgender community represents. So either way, if you're looking at an idea of incentive, side opposition does not achieve that. But let's say they do, right? Let's say that on side proposition, they do achieve some sort of incentive. We tell you on our side of the house, we still achieve some form of incentive, right? People will sort out to understand why specifically a female within this job or within this workspace, right, identifies as a male. Why the legal documents state that they're a male, right? This is you're more likely to have curiosity being piqued in a world where things are a bit more queer, in a world where things are a bit more askew than a world where things are far more straightforward. We tell you human nature is curiosity, right? Human nature is curiosity in a situation where things don't look the way that they're supposed to, which is our world panel, right? Which is a world where somebody who identifies as a male but necessarily looks female, right? Where they have the right to have their legal documents stating that they're male. That's the world that we're representing. That's the world that's a bit more out of the ordinary, and the world that piques curiosity better. So on the idea of incentive to understand, we see that we achieve that better on our side of the house. Finally, onto my pragmatic benefits, So what this discrimination looks like, right? We tell you discrimination in the world that we see is a world whereby we have situations where transgender people don't necessarily get jobs simply because documentation states that they're transgender, right? We see that this is a world where a conservative boss chooses not to hire a person because their documentation states that they're transgender, right? Because their documentation states that they're transgender and they don't believe in this specific line of thought. We tell you that that's what this discrimination looks like. That's the discrimination that we're trying to fight against on side prop case, right? Discrimination can also be taken to blown up to a larger extent, right? We tell you it looks like people walking in the street and people actively trying to harm or harass these transgender people, right? We tell you that it looks like people walking in the street on a day-to-day basis and being judged and being persecuted right? We tell you that this is a world that we're not willing to let people live in. We tell you this is a world that we mitigate better on our side of the house. It's a world that we're willing to let people exist in, right? So if you were to truly prioritize, even if side proposition wants to claim that we strip people of their identities, right? We tell you, first of all, an identity is not a label, ladies panel. We tell you an identity is simply stating that you're transgender. An identity is an experience, it's a person, right? Transgender is not a label that states a label on a piece of paper. It is an experience, it is a human being, it's somebody, so we're not willing to take the characterization that simply because somebody is no longer gets to identify as trans, or documents no longer get to say that they're a trans person, they simply lose their identity. Right? And so because of this, we tell you people are far more willing to live in a world where they're not harassed, to live in a world where they get the job opportunities that they want. They're far more willing to live in that world. They're far more willing to live in that world if it meant that they had to sacrifice a label or a piece of paper or something that was in writing, right? But before I move on, I'll take a point.
You claim how human curiosity drives people to understand each other. Well, then why do you say that when the European colonizers came to Africa and they saw people who looked different from themselves, they did not bother to understand them, but rather enslave them?
They're not European.
Welcome the second position speaker to extend their case. Here.
Sorry, I just want to confirm. I just want to confirm that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'll then be starting in 3. Side proposition. Spectrum of the way trans people and understand gender. We stand for a world where trans people are accepted. Gender is empowering, not digressive, and that each day. Firstly, I am going to be doing a bit of rebuttal. Some of it will be integrated, and secondly, I'll then move into my positive matter, where I'll talk about how proposition negatively changes the way society perceives gender and why we are better in the long term. Moving on into my rebuttal, though. Our proposition tries to tell us that there's a difference between perception and appearance, and they don't require individuals to fully transition in order to pass. We tell you that your case relies on individuals being able to pass as cis, to the point that they're no longer perceived as being trans. So as much as they can tell us there's a difference between perception and appearance, there's not on their side, because their case only works if their appearance matches the way society thinks a specific gender should look like, which is intrinsic to appearance, regardless of what they'll try to tell you. Also, in the status quo, legal change of gender is possible without passing as cis. So we think that that is not something that is valid on their side or something they can propose as revolutionary or new. But moving on into my first point of rebuttal, i.e., how do we best solve discrimination? Important because this is the one benefit that their whole case relies on and revolves around. So the premise of this was that currently trans people face discrimination in the workplace, at home, or at school, and thus the best way to solve this is to integrate them into society, and thus they are less likely to face discrimination. Under this, I'll show you how you don't do this and how discrimination is actually worsened on your side. So this entire argument assumes that all trans people are able to pass. Our first speaker told you already that there are various barriers: access to resource, location, money, or even a desire to conform in the first place. So in these cases, we can already tell you discrimination worsens for those individuals and still exists. But even if all individuals are able to pass, we still think it is worse on your side because society comes to see gender as a set, either you conform as a man or woman, and how society traditionally views that. We think this enforces the toxic ideal that trans people aim to escape in the first place. At least on our side, trans people are able to escape oppressive boxes and labels that made them feel discriminated against in the first place. We think under this, we show you how A, you don't solve discrimination, and B, how even in our worst case scenario, we support principles that empowers transgender people as opposed to subjecting them to the discrimination and oppressive view of gender that made them feel excluded in the first place. Second point of rebuttal, however, had to do with which side best integrates transgender people into society. This was a huge part of their case, and is also the mechanism in which they believe discrimination was eliminated in the first place. So Proposition tried to tell you that by supporting their policy, you fulfill the principle of all people deserving to feel comfortable in society. I will show you specifically in my positive matter how you don't achieve this on our side, how we are better at achieving this, and how you actually worsen the comfort that people currently find in society. Also, I will show you in regards to their second speaker's point regarding how curiosity is also better on our side. But saying that, I would like to move on into my positive matter. So under this, I'm going to be proving to you how Proposition negatively changes the way society perceives gender and why we are better in the long term for this. So the premise of this argument is that we believe side Proposition enforces an ideal that gender is defined by someone's ability to conform within a gender stereotype. I will prove to you how this is inherently toxic and how on your side we are better for the societal perception of gender. So I'll frame my analysis under two questions. Firstly, how is gender currently perceived? And secondly, how does your side negatively change that? So we think in the status quo, we as society generally perceive gender in two main ways. Firstly, gender being a societal construct, and thus the only way to identify as a particular gender is to conform to society's current view of this. This looks like passing this, what side Proposition proposes, and that is where it becomes prevalent, as individuals feel that in order to identify as their particular gender, one needs to look how society traditionally perceives them to look like. This is often aligned with sex rather than individual gender expression. Second way we think society perceives gender is as something internal and defined by one's individual understanding of what gender means to them. This looks like movements such as feminism's makeup doesn't define gender, or genitalia doesn't equate to a gender, or Billy Porter wearing a tuxedo dress to the Oscars. We think although individuals fall on different extremes of the spectrum or somewhere in between, in status quo, there are a range of ways people can identify and define their own impersonal interpretation of gender. We think the spectrum is also particularly positive in status quo because we start to see a slow acceptance of the community as even cis individuals begin to change the way they perceive gender as something that is fluid and rigidly defined by one's appearance or their ability to pass. I think when you encourage cis-passing privilege, you enforce the first way we perceive gender as being a societal construct, and thus the only way to identify gender is to conform to inherently negative in two ways. Firstly, it excludes those who perceive gender as something internal and by one's own individual experience and understanding of what gender means to them personally. We believe this exclusivity is toxic and divisive within the trans community, where people may have multiple understandings of how gender is perceived. Secondly, we think it threatens the atmosphere of safety and acceptance that they often feel within the trans community. Why is this? Because some people may feel that because they don't conform to this ideal of cis-passing privilege, they don't belong in the community, or they may feel pressured to change their perception of gender to conform. We think this is extremely important because side proposition tries to tell you that discrimination only exists on our side. We tell you through this that on their side, you often can experience discrimination within the transgender community. Therefore, why is this worse on your side, particularly for the community? Because we think this is a community where trans people derive comfort and support. And on your side, people feel alienated from the community because they don't conform to this aspiration. And because they may continue to face discrimination, like my first speaker told you, trans people are left with no safety net. At least on our side, even if they face discrimination, they have the trans community as a layer of support, which doesn't exist on your side. We think also, therefore, curiosity is better on our side because individuals are able to experiment with their own, the wide spectrum that gender can represent for them personally. So we think ultimately on our side, it should be valued above your side, because in your best case scenario, where transgender people are accepted by general society because they all pass as cis. But in the reality, many of these people have had to compromise their view of gender because of pressure from the community, and those that didn't feel isolated and lack the people they needed support from originally. At least on our side, we embrace choice and a diverse spectrum of gender perception and an acceptance in the community regardless of this expression. So though discrimination may exist on our side in the short term, we are better in the long term, which is the most sustainable approach and what the transgender community should support anyway. So therefore, I've shown you how our side is the best way for individuals to integrate into society in ensuring a spectrum of understanding of gender, and therefore seeing a slow acceptance of the community as cis individuals change their perception of gender. We think that we are better on our side, and we think that we win in those two regards. So proud to oppose.
I will thank the second opposition for that speech and welcome the government reply to summarize their case.
I'd like to check that I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, hold on. Let me just set my timer. Okay, assuming that I'm still audible, I'll be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel. Trans people are part of the most persecuted and alienated group of people. Although society has progressed and ended the oppression of other minorities, the trans community has often been overlooked time and time again. And panel, at a point in time where opposition fails to recognize this, is a point in time where they lose this debate, and at a point in time where they don't prioritize the needs and the safety of trans people within our community, especially since we're looking at the most vulnerable stakeholders, which is trans people, especially in conservative countries where they're currently facing atrocities on atrocities, ladies and gentlemen. And this is why it is such an important thing that we grant them this and support this. So our metric of support, as stated by my previous speakers, is first of all, the benefits of what benefits the most vulnerable stakeholders, and secondly, the mitigation of discrimination within our society. And through that, I'll be analyzing our team's case and the other team's case on a comparative. So in my speech, I'm going to first of all bring you rebuttals integrated under clashes, a comparative analysis, and weigh in at the end. So the main clashes we received in today's debate, first of all, the biggest clash that this debate boils down to is the characterization of trans people and what trans people desire and want. And this is specifically falls into the whole issue of perception and what is deemed the perception of these trans people and if it is important. So opposition came up here and characterized our side of the debate as, wanting trans people to encourage trans people to look like the stereotypical male and female. And this is simply untrue, because we as proposition delegation have continuously told you how we are fighting for society change in certain systems in place that continuously segregate trans people from the very identities they seek to join. And like my second speaker stated, things like on your ID, where you can constantly reminded of the gender that you've transitioned out of, you're constantly reminded of the past when all you want to look at is your future. Things like bathrooms, where another bathroom is created solely for trans people. This isolates them from the rest of the community, and this actually makes discrimination higher on their side of the debate. So that's the first level. And then on the second level, we need to look at what exactly do trans people seek and desire as trans people and as a community. First of all, these are people that were uncomfortable in their birth gender, first of all. So we need to acknowledge that. Secondly, they have sacrificed conformity within society to change into the gender that they believe is right for them. And third of all, they even go to the extent of undergoing medical procedures to affirm this belief. And we believe all these things show a deep desire within, an innate deep desire within these trans people to simply reflect their innermost emotions. And we believe as proposition, we're simply encouraging that and extending that into the systems in place in society to acknowledge in these trans people and the desire to fit into what they believe is right for them. So on the second level of analysis, we support people embracing themselves, yes. But when you're constantly being isolated and classified as other, we don't think they can embrace that. We don't think they can embrace isolation. And we don't think as proposition delegation, opposition delegation, we should settle for people being isolated and say, yes, you know what, you should embrace it because you're trans, you should embrace it. No, we believe they deserve to be treated with decency and respect by society, and the best way to grant them that is through cis-passing privileges, right? So secondly, I think we need to look at the psychological disposition of trans people in the first place. These are people that have gone through immense, intense trauma. Because something like your body, something you inhabit in 24/7, and it's traumatic not to believe like you belong in that. And most of these people aren't even supported by their friends or family for their identity. They're kicked out of the household and all these things. And opposition still states that they should just accept that. They should just, conform into that. But we believe, no, they should be integrated into mainstream society to normalize trans people, and that trans people come in all different shapes, sizes, and forms, but they're still a part of gender that they believe is right for them. Secondly, we also need to look at the fact that in conservative states, it's actually more crucial for these trans people because people getting stoned, jailed, and burnt at the moment, ladies and gentlemen. Opposition expects trans people to just ask the oppressors to respect them, and that will work. They just expect trans people within those states to conform to this and, embrace themselves. But ladies and gentlemen, this is simply impractical. So we believe as a proposition delegation that perception is not determined by appearance alone, but we believe that perception is how people view you and how they treat you accordingly. And that is how we would like to change society's perception through these systems, that trans people are treated the way that they want to be treated in the gender and sex that they feel comfortable in. Secondly, there was the point of exclusion and labels and that main clash. And opposition came here and talked about how trans people don't want to conform to gender stereotypes and more forced perception of gender on them. And on our side of the house, this looks like trans people being accepted for who they are into the gender that they want to be. We're not saying that we are going to force everyone to transition all the way to look like, a specific type of woman, but we're simply stating that no matter in what point of your trans journey you are recognized as an individual of the sex and the gender that you so wish and desire to be. I'll take your point now.
If you're understanding that there's no distinction between perception and appearance, are trans people then discriminated against based on the perception or the appearance of them in society?
They're based on the belief that, especially in conservative states, that people believe that being trans is wrong, that people believe that is a sin, maybe in Christian or Muslim states. So we believe that if we change this perception within people, then these trans people are treated better. And that's what we are fighting for on our side of the house. So we've told you that how will these people integrate into society if society continues to shun them? The thing is, we need to fix the problems existing in society by granting these trans people cis-passing privilege. And opposition's case is set in a utopic world where none of these other factors affect trans people, and trans people can just, accept, the predicament they're in, accept, the isolation and the alienation that they continuously suffer. So the relevance of these rebuttals is the fact that with the characterization of trans people that we've provided for you, we've shown you how what they want is to be this specific gender that they've gone so far as even getting surgery for. And we simply want to grant cis-passing privileges that not just only them acknowledge that, but society as a whole acknowledges that wish and respects it and treats them accordingly, so that they don't face discrimination in the workplace, on the social level, and in general, they don't face discrimination because of them being trans within that. So on a comparative analysis, ladies and gentlemen, on their side of the house, they haven't really solved the problem of discrimination. They haven't solved the problem of trans people continuously being targeted because they're trans. They've simply just said, okay, you guys are trans, acknowledge that you're trans, and you know what, just embrace it, just embrace it. They haven't solved the issue of the trans people at heart. And on our side of the house, proposition has simply have simply shown that by giving them these cis-passing privileges, we are integrating them within our society and normalizing trans people's being included as the gender that they want to be, right? So in our world, we believe on a comparative, we are better in terms of protecting trans people who are such a vulnerable stakeholder within today's debate, right? And also, even if all our pragmatic benefits don't apply in today's debate, cis-passing privilege, we're still normalizing trans people, and this will in turn reduce persecution and violence towards them. So we think on a comparative, we do better for the trans community. And in that, ladies and gentlemen, we continue to normalize them in society, and then they can, spread being trans. They can talk about it openly without being shunned, and society is more likely to listen once we've normalized it, once we've made you realize that, you know what, a trans person is no more different than you and me. A trans person is the same. Just because they're trans doesn't mean they're any different. And with that, I've never been proud that you propose.
Thank the government whip for that fine speech. The opposition will summarize their again.
Hey everyone, my name is Zara. I use she, her pronouns, and I would prefer verbal POIs. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. You don't look trans. We think that this is a common microaggression that many trans people experience. We think that it implies that they can't be beautiful or masculine unless they conform to cisgender standards. It implies there's something false or wrong about being seen or appearing as trans. The first speaker came up here and told us that they believe that everyone in our society, they told us vulnerable. We don't think they can ever achieve that in a case where they deny the identity of these individuals and don't make an effort to break down social stigmas in the hopes of, oh, we'll improve perception and everything will suddenly get better. We think that what's important to note within this case is 2 strategic flaws. The first one being is within their case setup, we don't really get a clear definition or clear analysis about what does it mean, what does it look like to aspire for cis-passing privilege. We think that is why the debate has gotten so messy and why we've had an unnecessary clash. But we think they also assume that the trans community is a monolith. They haven't engaged with ideas about the different intersections of identity within the trans community or the different people in the trans community and how some individuals might not want to conform to cis-passing privileges. We think that the strategic flaws alone makes the case incredibly difficult to engage with, but with that, we're going to take them at their best. We think that there's 2 main clashes within this debate. The first one being, how can we best protect the trans community? And under this, we have arguments about discrimination and identity. And the second one being, how do we further the aims of the trans community and keep it a safe space? That's looking at the idea of how our side changes the way society views gender. The clash that we've gotten most engagement about is how can we best protect the trans community? And we think that this is the most important clash within this debate. Under this, we have a clash that we don't necessarily think is something that was in the spirit of the debate, the idea of perception. A very simple way to take their clash down is to look at all of the analysis they give us, right? They tell us that they want to change public and legal documentation of this, but the pragmatic benefits aren't achieved by this. See, they tell you that they want a reduction in hate crimes. We don't necessarily think if someone's about to hate crime you, they're going to start looking at your legal documentation. We think that the discrimination faced by trans people is very much based on appearance. We think that those things include things like your life and jobs. We don't think that in terms of jobs, they discriminate against you because of your passport. We think it's because of your appearance. We think that when they see those as their pragmatic benefits, they have to understand that perception in this case is directly linked to appearance. That's to say that our side doesn't necessarily have to say, oh, we don't want to change public legal documentation, oh, we don't want to change stigma. We think that we can still advocate for these things while saying that we don't necessarily think that trans people should have to go into cis-passing privilege, should have to conform to a cis identity and ignore their trans identity in order to achieve these specific benefits. We think that is something very important within this case. We think that here, when they give us argumentation, then, even if we take them at their best and say this is about legal documentation, where they tell us, oh, we're going to solve things like hate crimes and we're going to be better for the lives and jobs of people, we think that what you then do here is you don't necessarily further the aim of the trans community as a social movement. We say, looking at this, one of the aims of this is to decrease stereotypes and stigmas about being trans. We think that the perception that you then create for like people within these jobs is not that you should accept people regardless of what they look like and you should respect their identity, but rather these trans people should try and aim to look more cis. That is the only way we accept them. We think that in that way you'd never directly benefit the transgender community. Even if you are able to curb discrimination in the long term, the inherent disadvantage of that is you're saying to these corporations or these jobs or just like characters within life in general, that in order for you to respect someone that's trans, they should conform to cisgender narratives of what they should look like. They shouldn't necessarily embrace their trans identity, and they should just like embrace like cisgender narratives of like passing to people. We think that this argumentation we get under this idea of like how they then change stigmas is something that is also quite problematic. They say they want to like pique the curiosity. Firstly, a response to this is we don't necessarily want people's identity to be your next mystery. We think that we want the identity of trans people to be normalized to an extent where you don't have people's curiosity being piqued by someone who is simply identifying as a different gender to what they were assigned at birth. We think that is incredibly demeaning towards that group. But even if we did say, yes, let's pique curiosity, we don't necessarily think that from what we see so far that curiosity is necessarily a good thing when you're looking at groups who have been previously disadvantaged. We think that my first speaker brought up a POI where she was like, in terms of history, we see we colonizers' curiosity was piqued. It wasn't for a good reason, it was for a negative reason. But even in the case where we take them at their best and say curiosity is something we value, we think it's better on our side where you say that this person identifies as, for example, a male, but they don't necessarily conform to the gender stereotypes of what a male in status quo should look like. We think that then you pique that curiosity better. Even if that is something that we value, we still get it better than you. The next idea they brought up here is the idea of how trans people generally go under lots of psychological harm because of their identity, and they want to achieve this above all else. This is where it becomes important to look at what does it look like to aspire for cis-passing privilege. This matter that, please note here, wasn't responded to my first speaker. We think that in order to aspire to be viewed or be perceived as a cisgender individual, different characteristics, including ability to access like economics or even your geography, like someone growing up in California is more likely to be able to access life-changing surgeries than someone growing up in Texas. We think that that is something that is inherently, has an inherent effect on how you're able to achieve or aspire for cis-passing privilege. We think that when they say they want to look after the most vulnerable, they don't necessarily take into account those individuals who simply can't afford to aspire to the cis norm. We think that is something that is directly harmful within a community that is striving for unity. We think that when they don't respond to that argumentation, they concede to the fact that some individuals aren't able to get to this. We think that the specific harm and specific importance of this is the idea of like lessening discrimination is very much dependent on all individuals being able to perceive to that, whereas ours is the social movement is more towards progress and think that even if we look at the idea of like the psychological harm that transgender people undergo whilst going through their identity, we think that it's worsened on your side because we think that you worsen insecurity and gender dysphoria because these individuals are almost racing to accept an ideal that puts an increased pressure on them in order to achieve it. We don't think you can ever solve that. But further than that, in terms of identity, you don't necessarily look at inherent problems that affect trans people because you're telling them to simply appear as cisgender, especially in institutions who have historic problems with affecting trans people, like the jobs you're talking about. We think the specific importance of this clash is then to look at how they don't necessarily protect the trans community, even under their own argumentation, but make it worse in the long term for individuals who aren't able to appear cisgender, and they create divisions in the community. The last clash here is the perception of gender. This clash still stands because they haven't responded to it. We told you that there are some individuals in the trans community that are gender fluid and non-binary. We told you you don't protect those people, but you also present gender as something that they have to conform to. You don't allow for people to have a more fluid understanding of gender. You alienate specific individuals from that community. We think that when you don't change the perception of gender within a society, you still allow the core problems that are affecting trans people to continue. You still allow the core problems that are affecting people in general to continue. We don't necessarily think that you can ever win this debate. We think that on a whole, side opposition has then shown you the importance of protecting the trans community in the long term from discrimination. We've shown you the importance of changing perception of gender. The only side that can win is side opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Welcome the opposition to end the opposition then.
Hi, I want to check in on the fields. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, so I'll be beginning my speech then in 3, 2, 1. It's quite ironic how proposition claims that we need legal documentation in order in society and in workspaces and to prevent hate criming when legal documentation doesn't allow representation for many identities, such as non-binary people, such as gender fluid people. We think at the very core, this is a strategic flaw that you need to identify, and you need to acknowledge that your own mechanism doesn't achieve any of the benefits you want to be achieved at the end of the day. So now let's do a quick way up at the end of this debate based on the two main clashes. First one on protection of trans community and the second one on identities. Let's look at what they gave us in the first clash. Firstly, they talk about integration to society. We already responded to this in my own one, where we told you how there's things like intersectionality, and furthermore, we can't just magically create integration when there's no change in stigma at all. And furthermore, not all people want to conform to a certain identity. And we don't think you gave us any kind of mechanism to actually deal with how you're going to make sure and cater for the people who actually feel excluded by this new privilege that you're supposedly supporting. Then secondly, they also brought up this idea of discrimination and hate criming and why this is such a serious issue. We need to acknowledge that opposition throughout the entire case have been consistent in saying that discrimination is something that we also want to remove and that transphobia is something wrong. But you need to see that, like we said from the very beginning in my O1, transphobia can't just simply be solved by telling every single trans person to just simply conform to a cisgender identity. That's not how this world or society works. At the end of the day, people who belong to a trans community need to step up and also tell society what they're experiencing in order for true understanding to be achieved at the very end of the day. Now let's look at what we told you. So firstly, under this clash, we gave you two arguments in my O1. The first one on social necessarily responded to very well because they still never really dealt with this properly in terms of saying how why just simply by having human curiosity then stigma is going to be removed. And we don't think all of your responses so far have sufficiently dealt with this idea of why having people becoming cisgender and conforming to this idea simply equals now every single cisgender person in society now understanding the struggles and respecting the transgender community. Secondly, we also talked to you about exclusion, and we also don't think this was dealt with properly because they have no mechanism to counter this exclusion harm that's exclusive to our side of the world. So which is why at the end of this clash, by doing a quick way up, we see not only have responded to all of the harms and also the supposed benefits that they have given us, but moreover, we think our benefits are exclusive to our side of the world. And furthermore, the harms have not been dealt with on their side of the world. And at the end of the day, we think we're definitely winning this clash. Second clash on identities. They gave us two arguments again. First one, around how perception does necessarily identity. We see my own two how society is already, which is why we don't think at the very core your argument really stands in the status quo. Secondly, they also told us about psychological harms, etc. We see how my O3 also respond to this on two levels by telling how, first of all, perceptions are not going to change, and also it's all going to be based on appearance, which is why the psychological harm of not belonging anywhere is not really going to be solved. And furthermore, we want to simply normalize accepting people as they really are in society, which is why then furthermore we think your harm of psychological harm is actually going to be better solved on our side of the world. So now, what have we told you under this clash? So my O2 has told you about how we want to remove these traditional stereotypes and also stigmas that come with them, and we actually want to protect actors such as like a masculine-looking women and feminine-looking men, because this whole idea of stereotypes is something to be broken down in order to achieve true representation. And once again, we don't think this kind of a benefit has been sufficiently dealt with on their side of the world, which is why, once again, at the end of this clash, we think that we not only do we have their harms and benefits on our side of the world, furthermore, we have benefits that stand nevertheless of whatever proposition can say. I am so proud to oppose.
Then the opposition replied and what the government to end.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, just let me set up a personal timer and okay. Granted that I'm still audible, I will be starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate was about who best protects the most vulnerable stakeholder who we have identified as transgender people. And we show throughout the course of my speech, I'm going to show how side does this by engaging their best case scenario and our best case scenario, and what has been presented to us throughout the course of this debate. Now, right? So side opposition wants to give us this idea or this narrative that identity is necessarily a label. Both sides of the House concede to the fact that somebody's identity is crucial, and both sides of the House present a proper argument about how this identity is something that we cannot let shift and we cannot let be watered down, right? So side props then tells you that identity is not necessarily a label, right? Side prop characterizes identity as an experience, as a person as a whole. If we look at identity holistically, where a side op wants to give us this narrative that identity is simply a label that says transgender, right? They give us the pragmatic benefits of somebody's identity, right? They tell us that people can then confide in other transgender people. They tell us of the idea of people can reach self-actualization and the like. We agree with these pragmatic benefits, right? But we tell you that at the point in which you give these pragmatic benefits and you state that they're only achievable when somebody has a specific label, that's when we disagree, right? So why we win on this clash? We've given you why this identity is so important, why these pragmatic and that this identity does not necessarily come into play simply because of a label that states that it's transgender, right? And on top of this, right, we achieve this identity better because we tell you that people don't actually don't get to self-actualize and identify simply because of a title that they have, but they actualize in the form of experiences, in the form, regardless of what they call themselves, right? So the next slash that we have is the idea of curiosity. They want to tell us that, so side proposition gives us this idea that in order for us to protect the transgender community, we need people to understand, right? To which we respond by saying that, yes, we need people to understand, but the best form of understanding is through curiosity, right? So both sides do not have the idea of exploring cultures. They don't have the idea of going deeper into the transgender culture, right? But we say on our side of the house, still we achieve the idea of, even if opposition did achieve this, we tell you that on our side of the house we achieve it better because we have a world in which curiosity is indeed peaked. We have a world in which more people are willing to try and understand. We have a world where more people are willing to look into it and more people are willing to try and comprehend what exactly is going on. Final level of analysis or final weighing, right? On the idea of a probability. So we tell you that proposition does a great job protecting the transgender community, but the problem with side proposition is that they only protect the transgender community in a utopic world, right? They protect the transgender community in a world where accepting, is all wanting society is willing to look at anyone and everyone, right? Why we win on this clash? We give you society in its society in the real world, right? We take the transgender community in the actual world, in what is on the ground, and the protection of the transgender community in a society that does not accept people, in a society that is primarily conservative, especially within low developed countries. We give you a society at its best and at its truest, right? We still manage to protect people in this community, right? Because we debate in the real world and we protect them. We give you the idea of people no longer being harassed in the streets, right? We give you the idea of people still getting jobs. Which brings me to the reasons that push side proposition ahead of op, right? First of all, we tell you that we engage in the transgender community holistically. We look at the transgender community not only as people who have completely transitioned, right? We look at the transgender community as people who have not yet fully transitioned. We look at those people that identify as a male, right? But within their paperwork cannot necessarily state that, or cannot necessarily step into the men's bathroom, even though they identify as male. We look at the transgender community on that level. We also then proceed to look at the transgender community on people who have transitioned and gone through surgery. We show you how those people then no longer face harassment within the streets, right? But let's just and then side opposition accuses us of then claiming that people need to completely transition. To which we respond by saying, even if you had to force people to, we say that people would then would much rather prioritize being safe and having a source of food label. So on either side, pragmatically and holistically, you see that side proposition wins on this clash, right? And then the idea of perception. We extend perception in its entirety, right? We extend perception to how people think of people and appearance, whereas side opposition decided to argue strictly on how people appear, right? To which we say this is not true, and this is not what equates to what equates to somebody's identity or to people's perception of a specific situation, right? Which at the end of the day, because we clash with proposition and we look at the motion more holistically, we attack side opposition's case at its best, at its worst, and at its mediocre. We tell you that that's why side proposition deserves to win this debate. There's so many points that they didn't engage us on. The idea of why identity is not specifically just a label. They choose not to debate in that world because they realize it's a strategic flaw that would make them lose. We tell you, because identity is not just a label, because identity is not simply something that is on a piece of paper, so identity is an experience, identity is a person, because we best explore that, we best protect the transgender community, we feel as though side prop deserves to in this debate.
I would thank the government whip for ending the debate, and I invite my panel to be back in class. Thank you.
Thank you.